Power doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about your bloodline, your loyalty, or how many throats you've ripped open to defend a throne that was never really yours. King Ronan Kadros learned that lesson the hard way when the empire he bled for decided his heart made him weak. They called him the Iron Wolf, undefeated, untouchable, a living god who couldn't bleed. But gods don't fall in love with their assassins. And when you break that one sacred rule, the whole damn world comes for your throat. Stick around till the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is listening. Because what happens next is going to change everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and what it really costs to be king. The nightmare always started the same way. Fire everywhere, black smoke choking the sky. And in the center of the inferno stood a girl with silver hair and chains wrapped around her throat so tight the metal bit into her flesh. Her eyes burned violet in the flames, staring straight through him like she could see every sin carved into his bones. Blood dripped from his hands. Not hers, someone else's. Always someone else's. And when he reached for her, tried to pull her free from the fire, she opened her mouth and screamed a name he couldn't hear over the roaring flames. Then he woke up. Same as every night for the past year. King Ronan Kadros sat upright in the massive bed carved from black volcanic stone, sweat pouring down his chest despite the cold air blowing through the open balcony. The silk sheets tangled around his waist felt suffocating. He kicked them off and stood, naked except for the scars mapping every battle he'd survived across his torso. Claw marks from rival alphas. Blade wounds from assassins who got close but never close enough. Burns from the uprising of the Eastern clans when he was 23 and stupid enough to believe honor mattered more than victory. He walked to the balcony overlooking Varkros Keep. The obsidian fortress stretched below him like a monument to violence. Towers carved from dead volcanic rock. Courtyards paved with black marble where soldiers trained at all hours. Rivers of molten lava flowing through channels beneath the palace, heating the stone floors and casting everything in a hellish red glow. Ronan built this place with blood and fear. Every brick represented a kingdom that bent the knee. Every tower stood as proof that mercy was the privilege of the weak. And he was not weak. Never had been. But lately, the nightmares made him wonder if strength was just another word for haunted. A knock at the door shattered his thoughts. "Come in," he said without turning around. The door opened and his war commander, General Vialor Draken, stepped inside. Tall, scarred, with eyes like chipped flint and a jaw that looked carved from granite. Vialor had fought beside Ronan for 15 years, saved his life at least a dozen times, killed more men than the plague. If there was one person in this empire Ronan trusted absolutely, it was the man standing in his doorway at 3 a.m. "My king," Vialor said quietly, "we have a problem." Ronan finally turned to face him. "When don't we?" "This one's different." Vialor's expression stayed neutral, but something in his voice carried weight. "The Festival of Dominion begins in 6 hours. Intelligence reports suggest an attack." Ronan felt his jaw tighten. What kind of attack? Assassination. Multiple entry points. Coordinated strike during the coronation ceremony. The Festival of Dominion happened once a decade, a week-long celebration where every noble house in the empire traveled to Varkros Keep to renew their oaths of loyalty. Public executions, gladiator tournaments, feasts that lasted until dawn. It was theater designed to remind the continent exactly who held the leash. An attack during the festival wasn't just bold, it was suicidal. "Who?" Ronan asked flatly. "We don't know yet." Vialor stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the evidence suggests they're not amateurs. Someone inside the palace is feeding them intelligence, guard rotations, structural weaknesses, entry points we don't advertise. A traitor. The word tasted like poison in Ronan's mouth. He'd executed men for less. Entire families, actually. Treason against the Blackfang dynasty carried only one sentence, and it wasn't imprisonment. But the idea that someone close enough to know palace secrets would betray him hit differently than battlefield enemies. Enemies on the field respected power. Traitors inside your walls meant the rot had already spread. "Double the guard," Ronan said coldly. "Lock down every entrance except the main gate. Anyone not on the approved guest list gets turned away or killed, I don't care which." "Already done." Vialor hesitated, then added carefully, There's something else you should know. What? The intelligence came from an anonymous source, a letter delivered to the barracks 2 nights ago. No signature. But whoever wrote it knew things only someone in the inner circle would know. Ronan stared at his commander for a long moment. Are you saying the warning itself might be part of the trap? I'm saying we need to consider every possibility. Valor's expression hardened, including the possibility that someone wants you paranoid, distracted, looking in the wrong direction while the real threat moves into position. Smart. Ronan hated that he respected the strategy even while it made his blood boil. Fear was a weapon he'd mastered years ago. Turn your enemy's mind against itself and half the battle was already won. He'd used that tactic 100 times on rival kingdoms. Watching it used against him felt like staring into a mirror that reflected every brutal lesson he'd ever taught. Fine, Ronan said finally. We proceed as planned. But I want eyes on every noble house during the ceremony. Anyone moves wrong, you put them down before they finish the thought. Understood. Valor turned to leave, then paused at the door. My king. If there is a traitor in the palace, we'll find them. And when we do, I'll handle it personally, Ronan finished. Valor nodded once and disappeared into the hallway. Alone again, Ronan returned to the balcony and stared out at the volcanic wasteland surrounding Varkros Keep. Miles of black rock, rivers of lava cutting through stone like veins of fire. Nothing grew here. Nothing lived here except soldiers and servants who understood that proximity to power meant you either thrived or burned. He thought about the nightmare again. The girl with silver hair, the chains, the blood on his hands. It meant something. He knew it the same way he knew when a storm was coming or when a rival alpha was about to challenge him. Instinct. The kind you couldn't teach. The kind that kept you alive when logic failed. But instinct didn't explain why the dream felt less like a warning and more like a memory trying to claw its way out of the grave. Ronan closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe. Tomorrow, the Festival of Dominion would begin. And if someone was stupid enough to try killing him in front of the entire empire, he'd make sure their death became the main entertainment. The throne room of Varkros Keep could hold 3,000 people comfortably, and twice that if you didn't care about comfort. Today it held closer to 5,000. Noble houses packed the massive hall shoulder to shoulder, their banners hanging from volcanic stone pillars that reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Gold, crimson, black. Every color represented a bloodline that had bent the knee and survived. Every face in the crowd wore the same expression, fear disguised as reverence. Ronan sat on the black-fanged throne at the far end of the hall, elevated on a platform carved from a single piece of obsidian. The throne itself looked like frozen violence, jagged edges, sharp angles, a seat designed to remind anyone who looked at it that comfort was never the point, power was the point. And power didn't apologize for the bodies it climbed over. The ceremony had been dragging for 2 hours. Speeches from minor lords, oaths of loyalty that all sounded the same. Gifts presented as tribute that ranged from priceless to pathetic. Ronan sat through it with the same expression he wore during interrogations, cold, unreadable. A mask perfected over decades until even he forgot what his real face looked like underneath. Beside the throne stood Valor, armored and alert, scanning the crowd with the focus of a predator waiting for prey to flinch. Further down the platform, the royal court clustered like vultures, advisors, generals, noble sycophants who thought proximity to the throne made them untouchable. Ronan knew better. He'd killed men standing exactly where they stood now, sometimes for treason, sometimes for annoying him during breakfast. The game of empire required sharks, but sharks still bled. Lord Carmine of House Delveris approached the throne with the exaggerated bow of someone who practiced humility without understanding it. He presented a chest filled with rare gemstones mined from the southern territories, going on about loyalty and eternal service and other words Ronan stopped listening to after the first sentence. Your Majesty, Lord Carmine finished with a flourish, House Delveris pledges its sword, its gold, and its sons to the glory of the Blackfang dynasty now and forever. Ronan stared at him for 3 full seconds before responding. Your sons, he said flatly. How old? Lord Carmine blinked, clearly not expecting the question. 15 and 17, Your Majesty, both trained in combat and eager to serve. Send them to the Northern Front. We're always short on bodies, willing to die for glory. The color drained from Lord Carmine's face, but he managed a tight smile. "Of course, Your Majesty. It would be an honor." "I'm sure it would." Ronan waved a hand dismissively. "Next." Lord Carmine retreated quickly, clutching his chest of gemstones like it might protect him from the reality that his sons were now conscripted into a war they probably wouldn't survive. Ronan felt nothing watching him leave. Sympathy was a luxury kings couldn't afford. You started caring about every family you tore apart, and eventually you'd stop tearing them apart. And then someone stronger would rip your throat out and take your throne. The Blackfang dynasty didn't survive 3 centuries through compassion. It survived through calculated brutality. Another lord stepped forward. Then another. More oaths. More gifts. More faces that blurred together into one endless parade of cowards pretending to be brave. Ronan's mind started to drift, his thoughts wandering back to the nightmare, the silver-haired girl, the fire. Then the screaming started. It came from the back of the hall, sudden, sharp, followed immediately by the wet sound of steel cutting through flesh. The crowd erupted into chaos, nobles shoving each other, trampling the weak, scrambling toward exits that suddenly seemed too far away. Ronan shot to his feet, his hand already on the sword strapped to his hip. Through the panicking masses, he saw them, masked figures in black, moving through the crowd like shadows with blades. Not random, not frantic, precise, coordinated. They cut down guards and nobles alike, carving a path straight toward the throne. One of them threw something small and metallic toward the platform. It hit the ground and exploded in a burst of fire and smoke that sent courtiers screaming in every direction. "Protect the king!" Valor roared, drawing his sword. But Ronan was already moving. He didn't need protection. He needed blood. The first assassin reached the platform and Ronan met him halfway. The man swung a curved blade toward his throat, but Ronan caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted hard enough to snap bone, and drove his own sword through the assassin's chest in one fluid motion. Blood sprayed across black marble. The body dropped. Ronan didn't stop moving. 2 more assassins rushed him from opposite sides. Ronan spun low, his blade cutting through the first one's legs and sending him screaming to the ground. The second assassin lunged with a dagger aimed at his spine, but Valor intercepted, running the attacker through before he got within 5 feet. The throne room had become a slaughterhouse. Guards clashed with assassins. Nobles crawled over corpses trying to reach the exits. Fire spread along the walls where something had ignited the ancient tapestries. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Through it all, Ronan moved like death incarnate. Every swing of his blade found flesh. Every step forward left bodies in his wake. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. This was a declaration of war. One assassin broke away from the main group and sprinted toward a side corridor. Ronan saw the movement and his instincts screamed wrong. The others were distractions, sacrifices. That one was the real threat. He chased after the figure, ignoring Valor's shout behind him, his boots pounding against stone as he followed the assassin deeper into the palace. The corridor twisted and narrowed, leading toward the lower levels. Ronan knew these halls better than his own reflection. Every turn, every hidden passage. He designed this fortress specifically so enemies would get lost trying to navigate it, but the assassin moved with disturbing confidence, like someone who'd studied the layout, like someone who'd been here before. Ronan caught up in a storage chamber near the armory. The assassin spun to face him, breathing hard behind the mask, a short blade gripped in one hand. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the assassin lunged. Fast, too fast. Ronan barely blocked the strike, his sword meeting the blade with a screech of metal. The assassin moved like water, flowing around his defenses, attacking from angles that should have been impossible. Ronan had fought hundreds of opponents, killed most of them, but this one moved differently. Not just skilled, desperate. They exchanged a flurry of strikes that would have killed anyone slower. Sparks flew where steel met steel. Ronan's muscles burned, his breath came hard, and then he saw his opening. The assassin overextended on a thrust and Ronan slammed his shoulder into their chest, sending them crashing into the wall. The blade clattered to the ground. Before the assassin could recover, Ronan had his sword pressed against their throat. "Yield!" he growled. The assassin went still. Slowly Ronan reached up and tore the mask away, and his entire world stopped. Silver hair. Violet eyes burning with hatred so pure it felt like staring into the sun. A face he'd seen 1,000 times in nightmares but never believed could be real. Scars along her jaw, blood on her lips, and something in her expression that hit him harder than any blade. Recognition. Not his, hers. The Alpha bond slammed into him like a fist through his chest. Raw, violent, undeniable. Every instinct in his body screamed mine with such intensity it drowned out logic, training, everything he'd ever learned about control. The wolf inside him howled, not with rage, with need. And from the way her eyes widened, pupils dilating, breath catching, he knew she felt it too. But instead of submission, instead of the bond pulling them together like it was supposed to, she bared her teeth and spat directly in his face. "Hello, Butcher," she hissed. "Remember me?" Ronan's blood turned to ice. He did remember. 12 years ago, the Crimson Purge, House Virel. He'd burned their estate to ash, executed the entire bloodline on orders from his father. Men, women, children, anyone who carried the name. It was the first time he'd questioned an order, the first time he'd felt the weight of what empire really cost. But he'd obeyed anyway because disobedience meant weakness and weakness meant death. Except he hadn't killed everyone. There'd been a girl, maybe 10 years old, hiding beneath burning rubble, silver hair matted with blood, eyes wide with terror. She'd looked up at him, and something in that moment made him turn away, walk past her, let the fire hide his mercy. He'd buried that memory so deep he convinced himself it never happened. But here she was, alive, grown, and staring at him with the kind of hatred that could level kingdoms. "You," Ronan breathed. "Me," she said coldly. "Celine Virel, last daughter of the house you butchered, and I've spent 12 years dreaming about cutting your heart out." The bond thrummed between them like a living thing, trying to pull them together even as every logical part of Ronan's brain screamed to kill her before she killed him. But his hand wouldn't move. The sword stayed pressed to her throat, but he couldn't push it forward, couldn't end her, couldn't breathe. "Why?" he said roughly. "Why come after me now?" "Because you took everything." Celine's voice shook, but her eyes stayed locked on his. "My family, my home, my future. You burned it all and walked away like it meant nothing. So I spent 12 years learning how to fight, how to kill, how to become strong enough to stand in front of you and watch you realize that the monster you created is the one who's going to destroy you." Ronan's jaw clenched. "I was following orders. You're the king." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't follow orders. You give them. Which means every death, every scream, every child who burned alive in that estate, that was you, your choice, your hands." She was right. He hated that she was right. The bond pulled harder, trying to override the violence, the history, the fact that she wanted him dead, and he should want the same. But fate didn't care about logic. Fate didn't care that his fated mate was an assassin sent to kill him. Fate just cared that they were bound. And bonds didn't break. Ronan stepped back slowly, lowering his sword, but not sheathing it. "You failed," he said quietly. "The assassination failed. Your team is dead. You're captured. Whatever revenge you came here for, it's over." Celine laughed. Actually laughed. A sound sharp enough to cut. "You think this was about killing you tonight?" She shook her head. "This was about proving I could get close enough, that your empire isn't as untouchable as you think, that the Iron Wolf bleeds just like everyone else." Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. She wasn't wrong. The attack had been coordinated, professional. Someone had fed them intelligence, guard rotations, structural weaknesses, which meant the rot went deeper than one assassination attempt, which meant his throne was already cracking and he'd been too blind to see it. Guards poured into the chamber behind him. Valeor at the front, sword drawn, blood splattered across his armor. He took one look at Celine and his expression went flat. "Is she the last one?" he asked. Ronan nodded slowly. "Take her to the dungeons. Maximum security. No one sees her without my direct order." "My king," Valeor started. "Now." Valeor hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but finally nodded. Two guards grabbed Celine roughly by the arms. She didn't resist, didn't struggle, just kept staring at Ronan with those burning violet eyes as they dragged her toward the door. Right before they pulled her into the hallway, she spoke one last time. This isn't over, she said quietly. The bond makes you weak, and weakness is how kings die. Then she was gone. Ronan stood alone in the blood-spattered chamber, his sword still in his hand, his heart pounding so hard it felt like his ribs might crack. The Alpha bond hummed beneath his skin like electricity. Wrong, impossible, unwanted, but undeniable. His fated mate was the last survivor of a house he'd destroyed, and she'd just promised to kill him the moment she got the chance. Valor stepped closer, lowering his voice. What do you want to do with her? Ronan finally sheathed his sword. Find out who helped her, he said coldly. Find out how she got inside. Find out who in this palace is a traitor. And when you have names, he met Valor's eyes. Bring them to me alive. I want to hear them scream before they die. Valor nodded and left. Alone again, Ronan closed his eyes and tried to breathe through the chaos tearing through his mind. The bond, the nightmare, the girl who'd become a weapon. Everything he thought he knew about control, about power, about what it meant to be king, suddenly felt like sand slipping through his fingers, because for the first time in his life, King Ronan Caedros had no idea what to do next. And in an empire built on certainty, doubt was the most dangerous thing you could carry. Spot. To be continued. What happens when the king who can't be killed meets the woman who refuses to stop trying? The dungeons of Varkro's Keep hold more than prisoners. They hold secrets that could shatter an empire, and Ronan's about to discover that some chains can't be broken with strength alone. The dungeons beneath Varkro's Keep smelled like iron and rot. Not the clean kind of rot that came from dead animals left in the sun. The human kind. The kind that soaked into stone after centuries of prisoners bleeding out in chains. The kind that reminded you exactly what happened to people who challenged the throne and lost. Ronan descended the spiral staircase carved into volcanic rock, each step taking him deeper into the belly of his fortress. Torches lined the walls at irregular intervals, casting shadows that moved like living things. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The sound echoed off stone in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. He'd built these dungeons himself 20 years ago, back when he still believed justice and punishment were the same thing. 2 guards stood outside the cell at the end of the corridor. They straightened when they saw him, fists over their hearts in salute. Ronan waved them off without speaking. They stepped aside. One of them unlocked the iron door with a key that looked older than the kingdom itself. Inside the cell, Celine sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall. They'd stripped her of weapons and armor, but left her in the black combat leathers she'd worn during the attack. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders, matted with dried blood. Chains connected her wrists to an iron loop embedded in the wall. Not tight enough to cut off circulation, just tight enough to remind her she wasn't leaving. She looked up when he entered. Those violet eyes hit him like a punch to the chest. The bond flared instantly, trying to pull him toward her with the force of something primal and stupid. His wolf wanted to tear the chains off her wrists, wanted to pull her close and never let go, wanted things that would get him killed if he was dumb enough to act on instinct instead of logic. Ronan forced himself to stay by the door. "Come to gloat," she said flatly. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Come to understand." Celine laughed. That sound again. Sharp enough to draw blood. Understand what? How to kill someone more efficiently next time. Take notes if you want. I'll teach you everything I learned studying your methods. Ronan felt his jaw tighten. Why the Festival of Dominion? Why now? Because you were vulnerable. She tilted her head slightly, watching him with the focus of a predator tracking prey. Surrounded by nobles you can't fully trust. Guards spread thin across the entire palace. And drunk on your own power. That's when men like you make mistakes. When you think you're untouchable. She wasn't wrong. The realization sat in his chest like a stone. He'd gotten comfortable. Started believing his own legend. The Iron Wolf who couldn't be killed. The Alpha King who'd never lost a battle. Legends made you careless. Made you forget that every throne was just wood and wood burned, metal bent. How many others? Ronan asked quietly. She blinked. What? How many others were part of this? The attack was coordinated. Professional. You had inside information. Someone in my palace helped you. Celine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Figure it out yourself. I will. His voice stayed cold. And when I do, I'll make sure they die slower than you can imagine. But I'm giving you one chance to make this easier. Tell me who the traitor is, and I'll make your death quick. How generous. She leaned forward slightly, the chains rattling. Let me ask you something, Butcher. When you murdered my family, did you make their deaths quick? Did my father get a clean blade through the heart? Did my mother get to close her eyes before the fire took her? Or did you let them scream until their lungs gave out? The question landed like a blade between his ribs. Ronan remembered that night more clearly than he wanted to. The Crimson Purge had been his father's order, a political execution disguised as justice. House Varel had discovered evidence of corruption in the royal archives, documents proving the Black Fang dynasty deliberately manufactured wars to maintain power. They'd planned to expose everything during the next council meeting, so the king ordered them silenced, and Ronan had obeyed, because that's what princes did. They obeyed their fathers. They protected the throne. They became monsters so the kingdom could pretend it was civilized. Your family was planning treason, Ronan said quietly. They threatened the stability of the empire. They threatened your father's control. Celine's voice cut through the cell like a whip. There's a difference, but you wouldn't know that because you've spent your whole life confusing power with righteousness. You think because you sit on a throne, everything you do is justified, every life you take, every family you destroy. It's all just necessary sacrifice for the greater good. She paused, her eyes burning into his. But tell me something, Your Majesty. When you look in the mirror, do you see a king? Or do you see a weapon your father pointed at anyone who questioned his authority? The words hit harder than they should have. Ronan had spent years building walls around thoughts like that. Questions that led to doubt. Doubt that led to weakness. Weakness that got you killed. But standing in this cell with the bond screaming between them and her hatred so pure it felt like breathing fire, the walls started cracking. What do you want from me? He said finally. Confession. Apology. You want me to say I was wrong. I want you dead. Celine's voice dropped to something cold and final. But since we both know you're not going to fall on your own sword, I'll settle for watching you realize that everything you built is rotting from the inside. Your empire is dying, Butcher, and the sickness started with you. Ronan stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. The door slammed shut behind him. The guards locked it, and Ronan stood in the corridor trying to remember how to breathe normally while the bond clawed at his insides, demanding he go back. Demanding he fix this. Demanding impossible things from a man who'd spent his entire life learning how to be unmovable. But here's the thing about being unmovable. Eventually, you forget how to bend, and things that can't bend break. The war room sat at the highest point of Varkros Keep, a circular chamber with walls covered in maps of the continent. Dravenmore stretched across the table, like a carcass waiting to be carved up. Red pins marked military outposts. Black pins marked rebellions that had been crushed. Gold pins marked noble houses still loyal to the crown. There were fewer gold pins than there used to be. Ronan stood at the head of the table with his generals surrounding him. Vialor to his right, Commander Ashara to his left. 3 other high-ranking officers whose names mattered less than their loyalty. They'd been arguing for an hour about how to respond to the assassination attempt. Publicly execute the prisoner, Ashara said flatly. Make it brutal. Make it visible. Send a message that attacking the crown has consequences. She was young for a commander, early 30s, scars across her knuckles from years of close combat, eyes like winter. Ronan had promoted her because she understood violence the way most people understood language, fluently, without hesitation. But executing Celine wasn't an option, not because of mercy, because of the bond. The Alpha Bond didn't care about politics or revenge, or what made strategic sense. It cared about one thing: keeping your mate alive. And if Ronan ordered Celine's execution, the bond would tear him apart from the inside. He'd seen it happen to other alphas who tried fighting fate, madness, deterioration. Eventually, they put a blade through their own throat just to make the pain stop. So execution was off the table, which left him with exactly 0 good options. The prisoner stays alive, Ronan said quietly. For now. Every general in the room turned to stare at him. Vialor spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. My king, with respect, that decision sends the wrong message. It makes you look weak. Ronan met his commander's eyes. I don't care how it looks. She has information we need. Names, contacts, how she got inside the palace. Until we extract everything useful, she stays breathing. It was a lie. Not a complete lie. She did have information. But that wasn't why he was keeping her alive, and everyone in this room was smart enough to know it. Ashara leaned forward. How long do we keep her? Days, weeks. Eventually people will start asking questions. Why the king is protecting an assassin who tried to kill him? Let them ask. Ronan's voice went cold. Anyone who questions my decisions can join her in the dungeons. The room fell silent. That was the thing about absolute power. You could make stupid decisions and no one could stop you. They could advise against it, warn you, beg you to reconsider. But at the end of the day, the king's word was law, even when that law made no sense, even when it cracked the foundation of everything you'd built, especially then. Valor cleared his throat. There's another issue we need to discuss. The noble houses are restless. Half of them lost family members during the attack. They want blood. If we don't give them a target, they'll start looking for one themselves. Let them look, Ronan said. Any house stupid enough to move against the throne can burn with the rest of the traitors. And if multiple houses move at once, Ashara's tone stayed level, but the warning was clear. If this turns into civil war, we might not have the numbers to win. Then we'll die fighting. Ronan placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. I didn't build this empire by being afraid of threats. Anyone who wants my throne can try taking it. They'll end up like every other corpse who thought they were strong enough. The generals exchanged looks. Ronan could read their thoughts easily enough. They were starting to question him. Not openly. Not yet. But doubt was spreading like infection. The assassination attempt had rattled them, and his decision to keep Celine alive instead of making an example of her looked weak, irrational. Exactly the kind of behavior that got kings overthrown. But here's what they didn't understand. The bond wasn't a choice. It was a curse disguised as destiny. And you couldn't kill a curse by pretending it didn't exist. My king, Valor said carefully, may I speak with you privately? Ronan nodded. Everyone else? Dismissed. The other generals filed out quickly, clearly relieved to escape the tension. When the door closed, Valor turned to face him fully. What's really going on? He said quietly. And don't tell me it's about information. I've known you 15 years. I've never seen you hesitate before. Not once. So what changed? Ronan wanted to lie. Wanted to feed Valor the same story he'd given the others. But his war commander had earned honesty. Saved his life more times than he could count. Bled beside him on battlefields where defeat meant annihilation. If anyone deserved the truth, it was the man standing in front of him. She's my mate, Ronan said finally. The words felt like pulling shrapnel out of a wound. Valor's expression didn't change for several seconds. Then his jaw tightened. The Alpha bond. Yes, and you didn't realize until after the attack. No. Ronan exhaled slowly. The moment I saw her face, the bond hit like lightning. I couldn't kill her, can't kill her. Trying would drive me insane. Valor was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question Ronan had been asking himself since that moment in the storage chamber. What are you going to do? I don't know. The admission tasted like defeat. She hates me, wants me dead. The bond doesn't change that. It just makes everything more complicated. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Valor crossed his arms. If the noble houses find out your fated mate is an assassin from a bloodline you exterminated, they'll use it against you. They'll say you've gone soft, that she's poisoned your mind, that the bond has made you unfit to rule. He wasn't wrong. Ronan had seen it happen to other alphas. The moment people thought you were compromised, the vultures started circling, allies became enemies, loyalty evaporated, and someone stronger took your place. That's why no one can know, Ronan said flatly. The prisoner stays in the dungeons. We extract information, and when this is over, I'll find a way to break the bond. You can't break an alpha bond. Valor's voice carried the weight of someone stating a fundamental law of nature. It's permanent. Trying to sever it will kill you both. Then I'll die trying. The words came out harsher than Ronan intended, but he meant them. He'd spent his entire life refusing to bend, refusing to let anything control him. Not fear, not mercy, not love. The idea that fate could reach into his chest and decide who he belonged to felt like the ultimate violation. Like everything he'd built was just theater and destiny held the real power all along. And if there was one thing Ronan Kadros refused to accept, it was powerlessness. Valeor studied him with those flat gray eyes. Then promise me something. What? If the bond starts affecting your judgment, if it makes you weak, you'll tell me, because I can't protect a king who won't protect himself. Ronan met his gaze. You have my word. It was another lie, because the bond was already affecting his judgment, already making him weak. He just couldn't admit it out loud yet. Couldn't face the reality that the iron wolf who couldn't be killed was being destroyed by something as simple as chemistry and fate. Valeor nodded once and left the room. Alone, Ronan returned to the map spread across the table. The empire looked smaller than it used to, more fragile, like one strong wind could scatter the pieces across the continent. Red pins marking rebellions, black pins marking threats, gold pins marking loyalty that felt more like tolerance. He'd spent 20 years building this, and one woman with silver hair was making it crumble, not through violence, through doubt, because for the first time in his life, King Ronan Kadros wasn't sure he deserved to wear the crown. 3 days later, Ronan went back to the dungeons. He told himself it was for interrogation purposes, to extract more information about the attack, to identify the traitor in his palace. Logical reasons, strategic reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with the bond screaming at him every second he stayed away from her. But logic was just the excuse. The real reason was simpler and more pathetic. He needed to see her again. The guards unlocked the cell and Ronan stepped inside. Celine sat in the same position as before, back against the wall, chains around her wrists. But something had changed. She looked thinner, paler, the kind of deterioration that happened when you stopped eating. When did you last take food? He asked. She didn't look at him. 2 days ago. Why? Because I don't take gifts from murderers. It's not a gift. Ronan kept his voice level. It's survival. You want to kill me. Can't do that if you starve first. Then I guess I'll die trying. Her tone stayed flat. Add me to the list of bodies you're responsible for. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that refusing food wasn't noble. It was just slow suicide. But part of him understood. Taking food from your enemy felt like submission, like admitting you needed them. And people like Celine would rather die than admit they needed anything from anyone. People like him too, actually. The bond pulsed between them, stronger now, more insistent, like it knew she was weakening and wanted him to fix it. Wanted him to break the chains, pull her close, feed her himself if necessary. All the soft domesticated instincts that had no place in a dungeon beneath a fortress built on violence. Ronan stayed by the door. Tell me about your family, he said quietly. Celine finally looked at him. Why? Because I want to understand who they were, beyond the reports, beyond the politics. She laughed, that sharp, terrible laugh. You want absolution. Want me to tell you they were secretly terrible people so you can sleep better at night knowing you only killed villains? No. Ronan met her eyes. I want to know what I destroyed. The honesty caught her off guard. He could see it in the way her expression shifted. Suspicion giving way to something harder to name. Not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of curiosity. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. My father loved books, she said softly. Collected them from all over the continent. History, philosophy, poetry. He believed that understanding the past was the only way to build a better future. My mother was a healer. Spent half her time in the lower districts treating people who couldn't afford physicians. My brother wanted to be a soldier. Stupid kid thought he could change the empire from the inside. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. They weren't planning treason. They were planning justice. There's a difference. Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. What did they find? Celine met his eyes. Proof that the Black Fang dynasty has been engineering wars for 300 years, staged rebellions, false flag attacks, manufactured threats, all designed to keep people afraid. Because afraid people need strong rulers, and strong rulers stay in power. She paused. Your family built an empire on corpses, and when my family tried to expose that, you burned them alive. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ronan wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the Black Fang dynasty protected the empire, that everything they'd done was necessary. But standing in this cell with her hatred burning through the space between them, the denial wouldn't come, because some part of him had always known that the throne demanded blood, that power required sacrifice, that every king in his bloodline had sold their humanity piece by piece until there was nothing left but the crown. And he'd followed that path without question. Until now. I was 21, Ronan said quietly, when my father gave me the order. It was supposed to be my proving ground. Show the kingdom I was strong enough to inherit the throne. So I took soldiers to your estate, and I did what kings do. I followed orders, burned the whole thing to ash. He met her eyes. But I saw you, hiding beneath the rubble, 10 years old, covered in blood. You looked up at me, and I should have killed you right there, should have finished the job. But I didn't. I walked away. Let the fire hide my mercy. Celine stared at him. You remember every detail. Then why didn't you kill me? Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he answered with the only truth he had. Because I wasn't ready to become a complete monster yet. Still had a piece of myself that believed mercy mattered. But my father found out eventually. Called me weak, said letting you live was the greatest mistake I'd ever make. So I buried the memory. Convinced myself you died anyway. That mercy was just delayed murder. He exhaled slowly. Looks like he was right. Celine's expression shifted through several emotions too fast to track. Anger, confusion, something that might have been grief. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You saved me. I gave you 12 years. Ronan's jaw tightened. You used them to come kill me. So maybe my father was right all along. Maybe mercy is just weakness wearing a crown. The bond flared between them, painful, insistent, wrong. Because fate didn't care about logic or revenge or who owed who blood. Fate just decided you belonged to someone and expected you to deal with the consequences. I hate you, Celine said quietly. I know, the bond won't change that. I know, but you can't kill me either. Her eyes burned into his. Because the moment you do, the bond will tear you apart. So we're stuck, both of us, trapped in this nightmare fate decided we deserve. Ronan didn't argue, because she was right. They were trapped, both of them, in a story that had no good ending. He couldn't kill her, she couldn't kill him, and the empire was crumbling while they stood in a dungeon staring at each other like two people drowning in the same ocean. Eat something, Ronan said finally. Please. The please surprised both of them. Celine's expression shifted slightly. Then she nodded once. Just once. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Ronan left the cell and ordered the guards to bring her real food. Meat, bread, water that didn't taste like rust. Then he climbed the stairs back to the surface and tried not to think about the fact that he'd just begged his prisoner to survive. Tried not to think about what that meant for the empire he'd built on never begging for anything. The betrayal came 3 days later. Ronan was in the throne room reviewing supply reports when Valeor burst through the doors with 6 guards behind him. His expression was stone, but his eyes carried something urgent. My king, he said roughly, we found the traitor. Ronan stood slowly. Who? Valeor hesitated. Then he spoke a name that made the world tilt sideways. Your brother. The words didn't make sense at first, like hearing a language you almost recognized but couldn't quite translate. Ronan didn't have a brother. He was an only child, his father's sole heir. The entire succession plan hinged on that fact. Except, 20 years ago there had been rumors, whispers about a bastard son, a child born to one of the king's mistresses, a boy who'd been sent away before he could threaten the legitimate bloodline. Ronan had been 12 when he'd overheard servants talking about it. And when he'd asked his father, the old king had backhanded him so hard he'd seen stars. Never speak of that again. So he hadn't. He'd buried it, forgotten it, convinced himself it was just palace gossip. But now Valeor was standing in the throne room saying that Ghost had come back. Explain, Ronan said coldly. His name is Damien Kydros. Valeor's voice stayed level. Bastard son of your father and a woman from the eastern provinces. He was sent to the outer territories as a child, raised in exile, but he's been building support for years. gathering allies, and 3 months ago he made contact with the Virel girl. The world stopped. Ronan felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart in a fist. Damien helped her get inside the palace, Valor continued, fed her intelligence, guard rotations, structural weaknesses. The assassination attempt wasn't just revenge, it was the opening move in a coup. Where is he now? Ronan asked quietly. Gone. Valor's jaw tightened. He disappeared the night of the attack, but we've been tracking his movements. He's gathering an army, promising noble houses that he'll restore honor to the Black Fang dynasty, that he'll fix the corruption, be the king your father should have been. Ronan felt something cold and final settle in his chest. His brother. His enemy. The traitor who'd been hiding in plain sight for years. And Celine had known. The realization hit like a blade between his ribs. She'd been working with Damien, using the bond to distract him, weaken him, make him question everything while his brother built an army to tear the Empire apart. Ronan turned toward the door without speaking. My king, Valor called after him. Where are you going? To get the truth. He descended into the dungeons with rage burning through his veins, the kind of rage that turned rational men into murderers, the kind that made you forget about strategy and consequences and just want to tear something apart with your bare hands. The guards unlocked Celine's cell. Ronan stepped inside and slammed the door behind him. She looked up, startled by the violence in his movements. You knew, he said flatly. Knew what? About Damien. My brother. The traitor who helped you get inside. You knew the whole time. Celine's expression shifted. Not guilt. Something harder. Defiance. Yes. The word hit him like a physical blow. Ronan crossed the cell in 3 strides and grabbed her by the throat. Not hard enough to choke, just hard enough to make his point. The bond screamed in protest, but he ignored it, shoved it down, buried it beneath layers of rage that felt safer than the alternative. Tell me everything, he growled. Now. Celine met his eyes without flinching. Or what? You'll kill me. We both know you can't. She was right, and that made it worse. Ronan released her and stepped back, breathing hard. His hands shook. Not from fear, from the effort of not tearing the entire cell apart. Why? He said quietly. Why betray me for him? Because he offered me something you never could. Celine's voice stayed steady. A chance to destroy the Black Fang dynasty from the inside. To burn the whole rotten empire to ash and build something new from the ruins. By starting a civil war. By ending a bloodline that should have died centuries ago. She leaned forward, chains rattling. Your family is poison. Every generation makes the world worse. So yes, I worked with your brother, helped him plan the attack, used the bond to distract you, and I'd do it again without hesitation. Ronan stared at her. And here was the point of no return. The moment where he had to choose. Trust the bond. Trust fate. Trust that somehow this woman who'd betrayed him was still his mate. And that meant something. Or accept that destiny was just another trap. Another chain. Another way for the universe to tell him he was never really in control. He thought about his father hidden beneath the palace. Thought about Damien building an army. Thought about the empire crumbling while he stood in a dungeon arguing with the one person who should have been his ally but was actually his enemy. And he made a choice. You're right, he said quietly. About my family. About the empire. About everything. The Black Fang dynasty is poison, and I'm the worst of it. Celine blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. But here's what you don't understand. Ronan met her eyes. Your plan failed. The assassination failed. And now my brother is coming, not to save the empire, to take it for himself. And he'll be worse than me, worse than my father, because men who grow up powerless become monsters the moment they taste power. He paused. So you have a choice. Stay here. Let Damien win. Watch him turn this continent into something even more brutal than what came before. Or work with me. Help me end this. Not for the empire. For everyone who'll die if we don't. It was the truth. Raw. Unfiltered. Terrifying. Celine stared at him for a long moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Why should I trust you? Ronan reached down and pulled a key from his pocket. The key to her chains. He held it out toward her. Because I'm trusting you first, he said quietly. I'm giving you a choice. Stay chained, stay safe, let fate decide, or take the key. Free yourself. And help me burn down the dynasty we both hate. The cell fell silent. Celine looked at the key, then at him, then back at the key. And in that moment, King Ronan Kadros realized something fundamental about power. It wasn't about control, it was about surrender. Surrendering the illusion that you could force people to follow you. Surrendering the belief that fear was stronger than trust. Surrendering everything you thought made you strong and hoping that what remained was enough. Celine reached out slowly. Her fingers closed around the key, and the world shifted. To be continued. The chains fall. The alliance forms. But some betrayals cut deeper than steel, and in the hollow throne chamber beneath Varkros Keep, a mad king has been waiting in the dark for his son to finally come home. The key turned in the lock with a sound like bones breaking. Celine pulled the chains free from her wrists and let them drop to the stone floor. The metal rang against rock in the silence of the cell. For the first time in days, her arms hung loose at her sides. Free, unchained, capable of wrapping around Ronan's throat if she wanted. They both knew it. The bond hummed between them, louder now, more insistent, like something that had been straining against a leash and finally felt the tension release. Ronan stood 3 feet away, close enough to stop her if she lunged, far enough to prove he wasn't trying to control her. This changed nothing about what you did to my family, Celine said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of 12 years spent sharpening grief into a blade. The bond doesn't erase that. Working together doesn't erase that. You're still the man who burned my world to ash. I know, Ronan said. And when this is over, when your brother is dead and the Empire stops eating itself, we're done. No fate, no bond, no pretending we're something we're not. Agreed. The word came out easier than it should have. Maybe because Ronan had spent his entire life making deals he knew would cost him everything, trading pieces of himself for the throne, for power, for survival. One more bargain with destiny didn't feel that different from all the others. Except this time, the price wasn't his humanity. It was his heart. Celine stepped past him toward the cell door. Her movement stayed careful, controlled, like someone walking through enemy territory who knew one wrong step could detonate a mine. When she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back at him. Where do we start? She asked. Ronan met her eyes. With the man who's been pulling strings from the beginning, my father. The hollow throne chamber existed beneath the palace like a secret carved into the foundation of the empire itself. Most people in Varkros Keep didn't know it was there. Even the guards who patrolled the lower dungeons had never seen the entrance. It was hidden behind a false wall in the oldest section of the fortress, accessible only through a passage that required 3 separate keys and knowledge of a door that looked like solid stone. Ronan had been there exactly twice. Once when he was 16 and his father showed him the chamber as part of his education and what it meant to be king. Once 3 years ago, when he discovered his father was still alive and learned exactly what madness looked like when it wore a crown. He led Celine through the winding corridors beneath the palace, torch in hand, neither of them speaking. The air grew colder the deeper they went. Damp. Heavy with the weight of stone and secrets and generations of rot. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The sound echoed off walls in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Behind him, Celine moved silently. She'd taken weapons from the armory on their way down. 2 daggers strapped to her thighs, a short sword across her back. The kind of arsenal that would have gotten anyone else executed for threatening the king. But Ronan had handed her the blades himself. Because trust wasn't about control. It was about stepping off the cliff and hoping you didn't hit rocks. They reached the false wall, and Ronan pressed his palm against a section of stone that looked identical to everything around it. Something clicked deep inside the rock. The wall slid sideways with a grinding sound that made Celine tense beside him. Beyond the opening, stairs descended into absolute darkness. "Your father's down there," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. What's left of him? Ronan stepped through the opening and started down the stairs. Celine followed. Behind them, the wall slid closed again, sealing them inside with the kind of finality that made breathing feel optional. The stairs went deeper than they should have. Down past the dungeons, down past the foundation, down into volcanic rock that still carried heat from fires that burned centuries ago. The temperature rose with every step until sweat soaked through Ronan's shirt, and the air tasted like sulfur and ash. Finally, the stairs opened into a chamber. The hollow throne sat at the center like a monument to everything wrong with the Black Fang dynasty. It was smaller than the throne upstairs, cruder, carved from black volcanic rock with edges sharp enough to draw blood if you sat wrong. No cushions, no decoration, just stone and violence shaped into furniture. Around it, the walls were covered in names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved directly into rock with tools that left jagged letters. Every king who'd ever ruled from this chamber, every rival they'd killed, every war they'd started, every betrayal they'd orchestrated. It was a ledger written in stone, a permanent record of exactly how much blood it took to build an empire. And standing in front of the throne, staring at the walls like he was reading scripture, stood King Malvek Kaedros, Ronan's father, the man who should have been dead. He looked like something pulled from a grave and forced to keep walking. Skeletal thin, skin stretched over bones like parchment, hair that had gone white decades ago now hung in brittle strands past his shoulders. But his eyes were still sharp, still burning with the kind of intelligence that made you dangerous even when your body failed. He turned when they entered and smiled. "My son," Malvek said softly, "you finally came home." Ronan's hand moved to his sword instinctively. Beside him, Celine tensed like a coiled spring ready to strike. The king who ruled Dravenmore for 30 years before Ronan took the throne should have been executed for madness. That was the story everyone believed. The official history. King Malvek had deteriorated, become paranoid, started seeing enemies everywhere. So the council forced him to abdicate, and Ronan stepped up to save the empire from collapse. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. Malvek had never stopped being king. He'd just moved underground, transferred power publicly while maintaining control privately. Let Ronan wear the crown and make the speeches and sign the decrees while he stayed below, pulling strings, orchestrating wars, making sure the Black Fang dynasty continued its work, creating the perfect alpha through endless conflict. "You're supposed to be dead," Ronan said coldly. Malvek's smile widened. "Death is for the weak, boy. I taught you that. A true alpha doesn't surrender to biology. He bends reality to his will." He gestured at the chamber around them, the throne, the walls covered in names. "This is the truth of our bloodline. Every king before you sat in this chamber and made the hard choices soft men couldn't stomach, manufactured rebellions to keep the provinces afraid, assassinated rivals who got too popular, started wars to cull the weak from the strong. It's not pretty, but it works." His eyes fixed on Ronan with the intensity of someone who'd spent years waiting for this moment. "And you were supposed to continue it, become the perfect weapon, cold, ruthless, incapable of mercy. But then you let that Varel girl live 12 years ago, and I knew. I knew you'd been compromised." Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. "You've been watching me. Every day." Malvek stepped closer. "Every decision? Every hesitation? I saw you struggling with guilt, questioning orders, growing soft. So I arranged the assassination attempt. Thought maybe facing death would remind you what strength looks like." He paused. "But instead you found your mate, and now you're bringing her here like some kind of ally. Proving everything I feared. The bond has made you weak." The words hung in the chamber like smoke. And here's where the philosophy of power gets complicated, because strength isn't always about domination. Sometimes it's about knowing when to change, when to adapt, when to look at the path your father walked and decide that maybe, just maybe, that path leads nowhere worth going. But kings who ruled from hollow thrones beneath volcanic rock didn't understand adaptation. They only understood force. Celine spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. Her voice cut through the space like a blade. "You engineered your own son's assassination attempt, to test him." Malvek didn't even look at her, to see if he'd finally become the king I raised him to be. But he failed, kept you alive, started questioning everything. The bond poisoned his mind exactly like I predicted. "You're insane," Celine said flatly. "I'm practical." Malvek finally turned to face her. "Empires aren't built by men who care about individual suffering. They're built by men willing to sacrifice everything, including their humanity, for the greater design. Your family discovered that truth. That's why they had to die." He looked back at Ronan. And that's why you have to die too, son. The bloodline is contaminated. Damien will take the throne. He's everything you should have been. Cold, calculating, uncorrupted by sentiment. He'll restore the Blackfang dynasty to its proper purpose. The words landed like hammer blows, because suddenly everything made sense. The attack during the Festival of Dominion wasn't random. It was orchestration. Malvek had arranged it. Fed Damien the intelligence, connected him with Celine, set the entire trap knowing that either Ronan would die and Damien would inherit cleanly, or Ronan would survive but be weakened enough that overthrowing him became possible. Either outcome served the same goal: continuing the dynasty's work through a king uncorrupted by mercy. Ronan felt rage building in his chest, the kind that made vision narrow and breathing difficult. His father had spent years manipulating him, using him, treating him like a project that could be perfected through trauma and isolation and systematic destruction of anything resembling compassion. And when that project failed, he'd simply move to replace it, like changing out a broken weapon. "You're wrong about Damien," Ronan said quietly. His voice carried the weight of something final. "He's not stronger than me. He's just angrier. And anger without direction is just violence. It doesn't build empires, it burns them. Then let it burn." Malvek's expression stayed calm. "Because from the ashes, someone stronger will rise. That's how natural selection works. The weak get cold, the strong survive, and the strongest of all become legends." He stepped toward the throne. "I gave you every advantage, every lesson, every opportunity to become what this dynasty needed. But you chose weakness, chose mercy, chose love over power. So now I'll do what I should have done 12 years ago when you let that girl live." Malvek pulled a blade from inside his robes. Long, curved, the kind designed for execution. "I'll finish the work myself." He moved faster than a man his age should have been capable of moving. Decades of alpha genetics and paranoid training made him lethal, even while his body deteriorated. The blade swung toward Ronan's throat in an arc designed to sever arteries and collapse windpipes. But Ronan was faster. He drew his sword and blocked the strike. Metal screamed against metal. The impact sent vibrations up his arms hard enough to hurt. Malvek pressed forward, using leverage and momentum, trying to drive Ronan backward into the wall. Behind them, Celine moved. She came at Malvek from the side, one of her daggers aimed at his ribs. But the old king spun away from Ronan's blade and caught her wrist mid-thrust. He twisted hard. Bone cracked. Celine gasped, but didn't scream. Malvek threw her across the chamber into the throne. She hit the stone hard enough that blood sprayed from her mouth. The bond exploded inside Ronan's chest, raw, violent, demanding he protect her, demanding he tear his father apart for hurting his mate. Every rational thought evaporated beneath the wave of pure instinct. He attacked, not strategically, not carefully, just pure aggression driven by something deeper than training. The wolf beneath his skin howled, and Ronan let it, gave himself over to the rage and the bond and the accumulated weight of every moment he'd spent pretending he didn't feel things. His sword came down like judgment. Malvek blocked, but barely. The old king was skilled, but his body couldn't keep up anymore. Age and isolation had made him fragile beneath the madness. Ronan pressed the advantage, strike after strike, each one harder than the last, each one carrying years of suppressed anger at being shaped into something he never wanted to be. They fought across the chamber, blades clashing in the darkness, sparks flying where steel met steel. Malvek was breathing hard now. Sweat poured down his face. His movement started to slow, but he was still smiling. "You feel it," he gasped between strikes. "The rage, the violence, the alpha taking over. That's what you really are, boy. Everything else is just theater." Ronan didn't respond, just kept attacking. Because his father was right about one thing. Violence came naturally to men who wore crowns. The question wasn't whether you were capable of it. The question was whether you let it define you. Malvek's blade came up too slow on the next exchange. Ronan saw the opening and took it. His sword punched through his father's chest and emerged out the back between his shoulder blades. Blood sprayed across black volcanic rock. The old king looked down at the blade protruding from his torso. Then he laughed. "Good," he whispered. "You finally became strong enough to kill your own father. Maybe there's hope for you yet." Ronan pulled the sword free. Malvek collapsed to his knees in front of the hollow throne. Blood pooled beneath him. His breathing came in wet rasps, but his eyes stayed focused on Ronan with something that looked almost like pride. "The dynasty continues," he said softly. "One way or another, because you can kill the king, but you can't kill what he built." Then he died. Just stopped breathing between one moment and the next, slumped forward until his forehead touched the stone floor like he was bowing to the throne one final time. Ronan stood over his father's corpse, sword still in hand, breathing hard. He'd just committed the ultimate treason, killed his own king, his own blood. The man who'd given him life and spent every day since trying to turn him into a weapon. And the worst part was that it didn't feel like victory. It felt like becoming exactly what Malvek had always wanted, a killer without hesitation. Behind him, Celine pushed herself up from where she'd hit the throne. Her wrist hung at an angle that looked wrong, but she didn't seem to notice. Blood dripped from her mouth onto the stone. She stared at Ronan with an expression that carried something between horror and understanding. "Is he dead?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Good." She wiped blood from her lips with her uninjured hand. One tyrant down, one to go. Ronan wanted to correct her, wanted to say that killing Malvek didn't make him a hero, that violence in service of ending violence was still just violence, that he'd crossed a line most sons never even looked at, and there was no coming back from it. But before he could speak, footsteps echoed from the stairway. Multiple sets, moving fast. Ronan spun toward the entrance with his sword raised. Celine grabbed one of her daggers left-handed. They both tensed, ready for whatever was coming through that opening. The first figure that emerged from the darkness wore royal armor, black plate with the Black Fang crest etched in silver, a sword that looked like it had seen 100 battles, eyes like chips of obsidian that reflected no light. Damien Kadros stepped into the hollow throne chamber. Behind him came 20 soldiers, all armed, all wearing expressions that said they'd come here to kill and weren't planning on leaving anyone breathing. Ronan's bastard brother looked exactly like their father had at 40. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller. But where Malvek's eyes had burned with controlled madness, Damien's carried something colder. Ambition. Pure. Undiluted. The kind that didn't care about philosophy or legacy or building something better. Just wanted the throne because thrones meant power and power meant you won. "Well," Damien said quietly, "looks like you saved me the trouble of killing the old man myself." His gaze swept across the chamber, took in Malvek's corpse on the floor, the blood pooling beneath the hollow throne, Ronan standing with a sword still dripping red, Celine injured but defiant beside him. He smiled. "Perfect. Now I can kill both tyrants in one day. Malvek for being insane, you for being weak, and then I'll take what should have been mine from the beginning." The soldiers spread out, surrounded the chamber, cut off every exit except the stairs behind Damien. It was a trap designed with military precision, the kind you didn't escape through fighting, only through dying. "You worked with him," Celine said flatly. She was staring at Damien with the kind of hatred that came from being used. "He promised you revenge, but the whole time he was planning this." Damien shrugged. "I promised you access. You promised me chaos. We both got what we wanted. Not my fault you caught feelings." He looked at Ronan. "Brother, you've been sitting on a throne you never deserved, playing king while the empire rotted, making weak decisions, letting sentiment poison your judgment. But that ends now." His hand moved to his sword. "I'm taking the crown, taking the dynasty, and I'm going to finish what our father started. Build an empire so brutal that no one will ever question our authority again." Ronan stared at his brother. And here was the moment where philosophy met reality. Because Damien was everything Malvek had wanted Ronan to be. Cold, ruthless, uncorrupted by mercy or doubt. The perfect weapon shaped into a king. And if Ronan fought him now, one of them would die. Maybe both. And either outcome meant the dynasty continued. Either Damien took the throne and became exactly what their father had designed, or Ronan survived and stayed king but spent the rest of his life knowing he'd become a kinslayer, a man who murdered his own blood to keep power. Both paths led to the same destination, becoming the monster. Unless there was a third option, one that Ronan had never considered before because it went against every lesson he'd ever learned about survival, every instinct, every truth carved into his bones by years of training. But standing in the hollow throne chamber with his father's corpse cooling on the floor and his brother's soldiers surrounding him, and the bond humming between him and a woman who'd tried to kill him, and the weight of an empire pressing down on his shoulders, Ronan finally understood something fundamental. Strength wasn't about holding power. It was about knowing when to let it go. He lowered his sword. Damien blinked, clearly not expecting that. The soldiers shifted uncertainly. "What are you doing?" Celine hissed beside him. "Ending this." Ronan's voice stayed calm. Not through violence, through choice. He looked at Damien. "You want the throne." "Fine, take it. I'm done." The chamber fell silent. Damien stared at him like he'd just grown a second head. "What?" "You heard me." Ronan dropped his sword. The blade clattered against stone. "I'm walking away. No fight. No contest. The crown is yours. Do whatever you want with it." Celine grabbed his arm with her uninjured hand. "Have you lost your mind? He'll kill us the moment we turn around." "Probably." Ronan met her eyes. "But fighting him means becoming exactly what my father wanted. Another generation of Kadros kings killing each other over a throne built on corpses. I'm breaking that cycle. Right here. Right now." He turned back to Damien. "But understand something, brother. The empire you're inheriting is dying. The noble houses are fractured. The people are starving. The military is spread too thin. That throne you want so badly, it's poison, and it'll destroy you the same way it destroyed our father, the same way it almost destroyed me. Take it if you want, but know what you're really taking." Damien's expression shifted through several emotions too fast to track. Confusion, anger, something that might have been fear, because Ronan was right, and they both knew it. The Black Fang dynasty was collapsing, not from outside forces, from the rot inside. And sitting on a crumbling throne didn't make you powerful. It just meant you'd be standing on the rubble when everything finally fell apart. "You're bluffing," Damien said finally, "trying to manipulate me, make me think the crown isn't worth taking. Believe what you want." Ronan's voice stayed level. "But I'm done playing this game, done sacrificing my humanity for power, done pretending that strength means never admitting you're wrong." He reached out and took Celine's hand. She flinched but didn't pull away. "We're leaving," Ronan said quietly. "You can try to stop us, kill us here. Add 2 more bodies to the dynasty's ledger, or you can let us walk. Take your throne, and deal with the consequences yourself." For several seconds, nobody moved. The soldiers looked at Damien. Damien looked at Ronan, and Ronan just stood there with his mate's hand in his, waiting to see if surrender would cost him his life. Then Damien stepped aside. "Get out," he said coldly, "both of you. And if I ever see you again, I'll finish what I should have done today." Ronan nodded once. Then he walked toward the stairs, Celine beside him, moving through the circle of soldiers who parted reluctantly to let them pass. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. Every breath felt like it might be his last. But they made it to the stairway, started climbing, and behind them, Damien Kaedros sat down on the hollow throne his father had died protecting, the last king of a dynasty that was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. Ok. They emerged from this palace through a servant's entrance near the eastern wall. Dawn was breaking over Varkros Keep, red light bleeding across black volcanic stone, the kind of sunrise that looked like the world was on fire. Soldiers moved through the courtyards below, unaware that their king had just abdicated, that the empire had changed hands in a chamber beneath the fortress without a single person witnessing it. Ronan paused at the edge of the wall and looked back at the palace one final time. 20 years. He'd ruled for 20 years, built an empire through blood and fear and systematic destruction of anything that threatened stability, become exactly what his father wanted. The Iron Wolf, the undefeated Alpha, the king who couldn't be killed. And now he was walking away from all of it. "Do you regret it?" Celine asked quietly. She stood beside him with her broken wrist cradled against her chest. Blood still dried on her lips, but her eyes carried something different now. Not hatred, not quite trust either. Understanding, maybe. Ronan thought about the question, then answered honestly. No. Because staying would have meant becoming Damien, becoming my father, becoming every brutal thing the Black Fang dynasty represents. and I'd rather die free than live as that." He turned away from the palace. "So what now?" Selene asked. "Now we disappear. Let Damien have his war. Let the empire collapse, and we find somewhere far enough away that the world forgets we ever existed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "That's not very alpha of you." "No." Ronan met her eyes. "It's not. And maybe that's the point." They walked away from Varkros Keep together as the sun rose behind them. Two people who should have been enemies, should have killed each other, should have let fate and bonds and destiny dictate every choice, but chose something different instead, chose to survive on their own terms, even if those terms meant abandoning everything they'd ever known. Because sometimes the bravest thing an alpha can do isn't dominate, it's surrender. Not to another person, but to the truth that power without purpose is just violence wearing a crown. And violence, in the end, only ever destroys. To be continued. The crown falls, the dynasty crumbles. But walking away from power doesn't mean escaping its consequences, because General Valeor has discovered the king's betrayal, and what he does next will determine whether Ronan and Selene survive long enough to see tomorrow. They made it 6 miles before Valeor found them. The northern road wound through volcanic wasteland where nothing grew except black moss and desperation. Ronan and Selene had stolen horses from a stable on the outskirts of the capital, riding hard through pre-dawn darkness while Varkros Keep burned behind them. Not literally, not yet, but smoke rose from the lower districts where riots had started the moment word spread that the king had disappeared. Power vacuums didn't stay empty long. They moved like hunted animals, fast, silent, stopping only when the horses needed water. Selene's wrist had swollen to twice its normal size, the bone definitely broken, but she hadn't complained once, just wrapped it tight with cloth torn from her shirt and kept riding. Pain was something you dealt with after you survived. Ronan kept checking behind them, waiting for the moment he knew was coming, because men like Valeor didn't let betrayal slide. They found justice, or what passed for it in an empire built on violence. The attack came at a narrow pass between two cliffs of volcanic rock, perfect ambush terrain. Ronan saw the soldiers emerge from cover a half-second before arrows started flying. He yanked his horse sideways, pulling Selene with him as they dove off the animals and hit the ground hard. 3 arrows punched into the dirt where they'd been sitting. Ronan rolled to his feet, sword already drawn. Selene came up beside him with her dagger in her uninjured hand. 20 soldiers surrounded them in a semicircle, all wearing royal armor, all carrying weapons that had tasted blood before and weren't afraid to do it again. And standing at the center of the formation, mounted on a black warhorse, was General Valeor Draken. His expression looked carved from stone, cold, unyielding. The face of a man who'd just discovered his king was a traitor and decided that loyalty meant hunting him down like a rabid dog. Ronan felt something heavy settle in his chest. Here's what most people don't understand about loyalty. It's not about devotion to a person. It's about devotion to an idea, a code, a belief that certain things matter more than life. And when the person you've served for 15 years violates that code, when they abandon the throne you've bled to protect, loyalty doesn't just evaporate. It transforms into something uglier, righteousness, the kind that justifies anything in service of what you believe is right. "My king," Valeor said quietly. His voice carried across the pass like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Or should I say traitor? Hard to know which title fits better now. Ronan kept his sword raised but didn't advance. "I'm not your king anymore, Valeor. I abdicated, walked away. You're free." "Free." Valor's jaw clenched. "You think abandoning your throne is freedom? You think running away with the woman who tried to kill you is anything other than cowardice? Call it what you want." Ronan's voice stayed level. "I made my choice and left the empire to burn." Valeor dismounted in one fluid motion, drew his sword. The blade caught morning light and threw it back red. "You trained me, taught me that a king's duty is to his people, that power means sacrifice, that you never abandon your post no matter how hard it gets." He stepped forward, but the moment it became inconvenient, the moment your mate bond made things complicated, you threw it all away. Walked out like none of it mattered, like the thousands of soldiers who died for your throne meant nothing. Celine moved to Ronan's left, creating space between them so they couldn't be surrounded as easily. Her dagger looked small compared to the weapons facing them, but the way she held it said she knew exactly where to put it to make men stop breathing. "You don't understand," she said coldly. "I understand perfectly." Valor's eyes fixed on her with pure hatred. "You poisoned his mind, made him weak, turned the Iron Wolf into something pathetic, and now the Empire is collapsing because he chose you over his duty." "It was already collapsing," Ronan said quietly. "Long before she arrived. The rot started generations ago. I just finally admitted it. So your solution is to run." Valor's voice rose slightly. "Let Damien take over. Let civil war consume everything we built. All because you're too broken to do what's necessary." "What's necessary?" Ronan felt anger starting to burn through his chest. "You want to know what's necessary, Valor. Spending your whole life becoming a weapon. Killing everyone who threatens your power. Sacrificing your humanity piece by piece until there's nothing left but the crown." He paused. "I did that for 20 years. Became exactly what my father wanted, and it turned me into a monster. So yes, I'm walking away. Because staying means becoming something worse than death." Valor stared at him for a long moment. Then he raised his sword. "Then you'll die a coward," he said flatly. "And I'll tell the Empire their king fell defending his throne. At least that way your legacy stays intact." The soldiers moved forward. Ronan and Celine pressed back to back, weapons raised, as the circle tightened. 20 trained warriors against 2 exhausted fighters, one with a broken wrist. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They were going to die here. But here's the thing about people who've already lost everything. They fight differently, not with strategy or caution or any concern for survival beyond the next 5 seconds. They fight with the kind of desperate violence that comes from knowing you're already dead and just haven't stopped moving yet. Ronan had spent his entire life fighting to win. Now he just needed to fight long enough for Celine to escape. The first soldier lunged, and Ronan met him with a strike that took his head off at the shoulders. Blood sprayed across volcanic rock. The body dropped. Another soldier came from the side, and Ronan spun, his blade cutting through armor and ribs and lung tissue. The man screamed and collapsed. Behind him, Celine moved like shadow given form. Her dagger found throats, found eyes, found the gaps in armor where steel met flesh. She was smaller than everyone around her, but that made her faster, harder to track. A soldier grabbed for her, and she drove her blade up through his jaw into his brain. He dropped. She yanked the dagger free and kept moving. They fought across the pass like 2 people possessed by something beyond training, beyond reason. Pure survival instinct weaponized. But there were too many. A blade cut across Ronan's shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, but he didn't stop, just shifted his grip and kept swinging. Another blade caught his thigh. Blood soaked through his pants. His leg almost gave out, but he forced himself to stay upright. Beside him, Celine took a strike to her already broken wrist. The sound of bone shattering was audible even over the chaos. She screamed, actually screamed. The first sound of real pain Ronan had heard from her. The dagger fell from her useless hand. A soldier raised his sword to finish her. Ronan threw himself between them. The blade meant for Celine's heart punched through his side instead. Steel scraped against ribs, tore through muscle, emerged out his back in a spray of blood that looked black in the morning light. Ronan grabbed the soldier's face with one hand and slammed his head into the cliff wall hard enough to crack his skull. The man dropped, but the sword was still embedded in Ronan's torso. He pulled it out himself. The pain was blinding, absolute, the kind that made you want to lie down and stop fighting. Just let death take you because anything was better than this. But Ronan had spent his entire life learning how to function through pain, how to turn agony into fuel. He raised his sword with both hands and roared. The sound echoed off the cliffs like something inhuman, like a wolf howling at the moon. Pure rage and defiance given voice, and the remaining soldiers hesitated. Just for a second. But a second was enough. Ronan attacked with everything left in him. His sword became an extension of his will. Every strike was desperation given form. Every movement burned through injuries that should have killed him already. Blood poured from the hole in his side. His vision started tunneling. His muscles screamed. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because Celine was behind him, and if he fell, she died, and the bond wouldn't let him fail her even if his body was shutting down. 2 more soldiers dropped. Then 3. Then Vialor stepped forward. "Move," he said quietly to his remaining men. "This one's mine." The soldiers pulled back, and Ronan found himself facing the man who'd saved his life a dozen times, the brother he'd chosen, the warrior who'd stood beside him through every battle and believed in the empire they were building, now standing opposite him with murder in his eyes. "You should have stayed dead," Valor said. "Would have been cleaner, more honorable, probably." Ronan's breathing came ragged. Blood dripped from his sword, from his body, from everywhere. "But I chose to live. Chose her. And I'd make the same choice again. Then you die for it." Valor attacked. And here's where the philosophy of combat becomes important, because fighting isn't just about strength or speed or technique. It's about knowing your opponent, understanding how they think, predicting what they'll do before they do it. Ronan had trained Valor personally, taught him every trick, every strategy, every weakness to exploit, which meant Valor knew all of Ronan's tactics too. They fought like mirrors reflecting violence. Every strike anticipated, every counter blocked. 15 years of training together meant they moved in sync even while trying to kill each other. Blades met with sounds like thunder. Sparks flew where steel scraped steel. They circled each other across blood-soaked stone, neither giving ground, both knowing this ended with one of them dead. But Ronan was injured, bleeding out from multiple wounds, and Valor was fresh. A strike got through Ronan's defense, caught him across the chest, ribs cracked. He staggered backward. Valor pressed the advantage. Another strike, this one to his sword arm. The blade cut deep into muscle. Ronan's grip faltered, his sword fell. Valor kicked it away and pressed his blade to Ronan's throat. "Any last words?" he asked coldly. Ronan met his eyes. "Thank you." Valor blinked. "What?" "For 15 years of loyalty. For believing in something, even if it was broken. Thank you for that." For a moment, Vialor's expression flickered. Something that might have been regret, might have been grief. Hard to tell with men who'd learned to bury emotion beneath duty. Then his blade pressed harder. "Goodbye, my king." But before he could strike, an arrow punched through his shoulder. Valor roared and spun. His sword swung wide, trying to find the new threat. Another arrow hit him in the thigh, then another in his side. The remaining soldiers scattered, looking for cover, trying to identify where the attack was coming from. Through the chaos, figures emerged from the cliffs. Dozens of them. Rebels wearing mismatched armor and carrying weapons that looked scavenged from battlefields, led by a woman with scars across her face and eyes like winter. Commander Ashara. She'd defected, brought half the northern garrison with her, and right now she was saving Ronan's life, even though 3 days ago she'd argued for executing him. "Fall back," Ashara shouted to her fighters. "Get the king out of here!" 2 rebels grabbed Ronan under his arms and started dragging him toward the horses. He tried to resist, but his body wasn't responding anymore. Too much blood loss, too much damage. Everything felt distant and cold. Through fading vision, he saw Celine being carried beside him, still conscious, still fighting even with one useless arm, still refusing to quit. Valor was on his knees in the pass, 3 arrows protruding from his body, roaring orders to soldiers who couldn't hear him over the sound of combat. Then everything went black. Tsuck. Ronan woke to pain, the kind that made you wish you'd stayed unconscious. Every breath felt like knives through his ribs. His side throbbed where the sword had punched through. His chest burned where Valor's blade had cracked bone. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Don't move," a voice said. "Ashara." She was sitting beside a fire, cleaning blood off her sword. "You're lucky to be breathing. That wound in your side should have killed you." "Where are we?" Ronan managed. 20 miles north of the ambush point. Hidden camp. Safe for now. His vision cleared enough to take in his surroundings. They were in a cave carved into volcanic rock. Small. Defensible. Fire burning at the center, casting shadows on stone walls. About 30 rebels scattered around, most of them sleeping or tending wounds. And in the corner, wrapped in blankets, was Celine. She was awake, staring at him. Her wrist had been splinted and bandaged. Someone had cleaned the blood off her face, but her eyes carried the same fierce intensity they always did. "You're alive," she said quietly. "Disappointed?" he asked. "A little." The ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Would have been easier if you'd died heroically. Made better story. Despite the pain, Ronan almost laughed. Why did you defect? He asked Ashara. The commander was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke without looking at him. Because I watched you fight. Watched you take a blade meant for her. Watched you choose something other than power. And I realized that maybe the empire I'd been protecting wasn't worth the blood anymore. She finally met his eyes. You were right. The Black Fang dynasty is poison, has been for generations. And if walking away from the throne is what it takes to kill it, then maybe you're not a coward. Maybe you're just the first king brave enough to admit the whole thing was broken from the start. How many came with you? Ronan asked. 43. Half the northern garrison. The other half stayed loyal to Valeborn. She paused. He's not dead, by the way. Took 3 arrows and kept fighting. Last I saw, he was regrouping with Damien's forces. So they'll be coming for us. Already are. Word spread fast. The king who abandoned his throne. The assassin who became his mate. It's the kind of story people tell around fires. Some think you're heroes, most think you're traitors. What do you think? Ashara was quiet for a long moment. I think you're 2 people trying to survive in a world that wants you dead, and sometimes that's the most honest thing you can be. She stood and walked toward the cave entrance. We leave at dawn. Head further north into rebel territory. Find allies. Build something. I don't know what yet, but staying here means dying. After she left, Celine pushed herself up slowly and moved to sit beside Ronan. Her movements were careful, protecting her broken wrist. When she settled next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched, the bond hummed between them. Quieter now, less desperate, like something that had finally stopped fighting itself. You should have let me die, she said softly. In that pass. Would have been easier. Easier isn't always right. She looked at him. Her violet eyes reflected firelight. We're not going to survive this, you know that. Damien has the empire. Valeborn has the military. We have 43 rebels and a story no one believes. Probably not. Ronan's voice stayed quiet. But we'll die free. On our terms. That's worth something. Is it, though? Celine's expression carried something vulnerable he'd never seen before. Because I spent 12 years preparing to kill you, building my entire identity around revenge. And now that's gone. The bond won't let me hate you. Won't let me pretend you're just the monster who burned my family. She paused. So what am I now? Who am I if I'm not the girl consumed by vengeance? Ronan didn't have an easy answer, because she was asking the question he'd been asking himself for weeks. Who are you when you strip away the crown? The power. The title. The role you've played so long you forgot it was just a mask. Who's underneath? And is that person worth saving? You're whoever you choose to be, he said finally. Not what fate decided. Not what your past demands, just you. Making choices. Living with them. Even if those choices get us killed. Especially then. Celine was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily. Without violence. Without the bond forcing it. Just chose to. And Ronan felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not power. Not victory. Hope. The fragile kind that knew it might be crushed tomorrow, but existed anyway. They sat like that while the fire burned down to embers and the rebels slept, and somewhere in the distance, an empire prepared for war. Chick. 3 days later, Damien declared himself King of Dravenmoor. The coronation happened in Varkros Keep with all the nobles who'd survived the purge. He wore the crown their father had commissioned, sat on the Black Fang throne, made speeches about restoring honor and strength and order to a kingdom that had gone soft under weak leadership. The people cheered, because people always cheer for certainty, even when that certainty means blood. Valeborn stood beside the new king as his lord commander. The arrows had been removed, the wounds stitched, and the hatred in his eyes had crystallized into purpose. Find Ronan, Damien ordered publicly. Find the traitor who abandoned his throne, and bring me his head. The hunt began in earnest. 5,000 soldiers deployed across the northern territories. Every road watched, every village searched. Damien put a bounty on Ronan's head large enough to make loyal men consider betrayal. But the north was vast, and rebels knew how to disappear. Ronan and his group moved like ghosts, never staying in one place longer than a night, always moving, always watching for pursuit. They recruited as they traveled. Deserters from Damien's army who didn't believe in the new king. Survivors from noble houses that had been purged. Common people who'd lost everything to imperial wars. The resistance grew. Not fast, not organized, just people who'd decided that maybe dying on your feet was better than living on your knees. They learned that Damien had begun executing dissenters publicly. Anyone who questioned his authority. Anyone caught harboring rebels. Entire families dragged into town squares and killed as warnings. The new king was making good on his promise, rule through absolute fear, and it was working, because fear always works in the short term. It's the long term where it falls apart. 2 weeks after fleeing Varkros Keep, Ronan stood on a cliff overlooking rebel camps scattered across volcanic wasteland. Maybe 300 people now, armed with scavenged weapons, held together by nothing but desperation and the belief that they were fighting for something other than power. Ashera joined him at the cliff edge. Damien's forces are getting closer, she said quietly. 3 days, maybe 4. Then they'll be on us. Can we fight them? With 300 against 5,000? She shook her head. Not a chance. We'd be slaughtered. So we run again. We're running out of places to run to. Ashera's expression stayed grim. Eventually we hit the ocean, and then it's over. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question he'd been avoiding for weeks. What if we didn't run? Ashara looked at him sharply. You're talking about a stand, here, with no fortifications, no supply lines, against the entire Imperial army. I'm talking about forcing Damien to face us. Make him bring the fight to ground we choose. Force him to commit everything to wiping us out. She studied his face. That's suicide. Maybe. Ronan met her eyes. But people across the continent are watching, waiting to see if resistance is possible. If we run forever, we prove it's not. If we stand and make Damien bleed for every inch, even if we lose, it proves that tyrants can be fought. And you're willing to die for that. I died the moment I've walked away from the throne. Everything since has been borrowed time. Ashara was quiet for several seconds. Then she nodded once. I'll spread the word. Make preparations. But understand something. She turned to face him fully. This doesn't end with you on a throne again, win or lose. You're not trying to take back the crown. I know. Then what are we fighting for? Ronan thought about Celine sleeping in the camp below. Thought about the bond that had saved him and destroyed him in equal measure. Thought about his father's corpse on the floor of the hollow throne chamber. For the right to choose what we become, he said quietly, instead of letting history decide for us. Ashara nodded again and walked away. That night, Ronan told Celine what they were planning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You know we can't win, she said finally. I know. And you're doing it anyway. Yes. Why? Ronan took her hand, the one with the broken wrist that had healed crooked but functional. Because every king in my bloodline chose power over people, chose domination over mercy, chose to become monsters because monsters survive. He paused. But I don't want to survive as a monster anymore. I want to die as something human, even if that means dying. Celine stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. Not gently, not soft, just raw honesty given physical form. The bond flared between them, no longer fighting, just existing. Acknowledgement that they'd become something neither of them expected. Not enemies, not quite lovers, just two broken people choosing each other in the middle of hell. When they pulled apart, Celine spoke quietly. Then we die together, on our terms, making them bleed for it. Together, Ronan agreed. And for the first time since walking away from Varkros Keep, he felt certain about something. Not victory, not survival, but purpose. The kind you died for because living without it wasn't living at all. The armies met 3 days later on a field of black volcanic glass called the Shattered Plain. Legend said it was where the first Alpha War had been fought 500 years ago, where thousands died and their blood soaked into the earth and made nothing grow ever again. Now it would host another battle, another slaughter, another moment where history decided who got to write it, Damien's forces spread across the southern edge of the plain like a wave of steel. 5,000 soldiers in perfect formation, cavalry on the flanks, archers in the center, infantry forming an unbreakable wall, banners flying the Black Fang crest, war drums beating a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. On the northern edge, Ronan's rebels looked like exactly what they were. Desperate people with scavenged weapons standing against an empire. But they stood anyway. Ronan walked to the front of the formation, Celine beside him, Ashara on his other side. Behind them, 300 rebels who'd chosen to die here rather than keep running. Across the plain, Damien rode forward on his warhorse, Valor beside him. They stopped 50 yards from Ronan's line, and Damien shouted loud enough for both armies to hear. "Brother, this is your last chance. Surrender. Face justice. Let these people go home to their families." Ronan stepped forward and shouted back, "There's no justice in your empire, Damien. Just fear. Just blood. Just the same cycle our father built and you're perpetuating. So no, we don't surrender. We fight, and we make you work for every inch. Then you die like the traitor you are." Damien raised his hand. The war drums stopped. The armies held their breath. And in the silence before violence erupted, Ronan looked at Celine one last time. "No regrets," he said quietly. "None," she answered. The hand dropped, and hell came to the shattered plain. To be continued. Steel meets flesh. Rebels meet empire. And in the chaos of the final battle, Ronan discovers that some things are worth dying for. But the question isn't whether he'll survive. It's whether he'll become the monster one last time to protect the people he loves, or stay human and let everything burn. The first wave hit like a tsunami of steel and violence. 5,000 soldiers charging across volcanic glass, with weapons raised and war cries tearing through the morning air. The sound was overwhelming, not just noise, but pressure, the kind that made your chest tighten and your ears ring and your instincts scream to run because nothing human could stand against that much concentrated death. But Ronan's rebels didn't run. They braced. Shields up. Spears forward. 300 people who'd decided that dying here meant something more than surviving as slaves to fear. The armies collided with a sound like the world breaking. Metal screamed against metal. Bone shattered. Men roared and fell and kept fighting even as they bled out onto black glass. The front line became chaos instantly. No formation, no strategy, just violence compressed into the space between heartbeats where you either killed or died and thinking was a luxury nobody could afford. Ronan fought at the center of it all. His sword moved like an extension of his rage. Every strike carried 20 years of suppressed fury at what the Black Fang dynasty had made him become. Every blocked attack was a refusal to submit to the inevitability everyone claimed he couldn't escape. Blood sprayed across his face, his arms, his chest, some of it his, most of it not. Beside him, Celine moved like a phantom. Her broken wrist was useless, but her left hand still held a blade and she used it with surgical precision. Throats, eyes, the soft spaces between armor plates where steel met flesh. She was smaller than everyone around her, but that made her invisible until the moment she struck. Soldiers fell without understanding what killed them. The battle raged for hours. Not clean, not heroic, just brutal attrition where bodies piled up and the living climbed over corpses to keep fighting. Damien's forces had numbers, but Ronan's rebels had desperation. And desperate people fight differently. They don't retreat when wounded, don't surrender when surrounded. They just keep moving forward until something vital breaks and they stop. But numbers always win eventually. Ronan's line started collapsing on the eastern flank. Too many soldiers pressing too hard. Rebels fell back step by step, trying to hold formation, but the Imperial Army was grinding through them like meat through teeth. Another 10 minutes and they'd be surrounded, slaughtered from all sides. Ashara saw it happening and made a choice. She took 50 fighters and charged directly into the gap. Threw themselves at the advancing soldiers with the kind of violence that made men pause even when they had overwhelming advantage. It bought time, stabilized the line, but it cost her half the fighters she'd brought, including herself. Ronan saw her fall from across the battlefield, saw 3 soldiers drive spears through her chest simultaneously, saw her drop to her knees and then to her face and stop moving. The woman who'd defected, who'd saved his life, who'd believed that walking away from poison was braver than drinking it, dead on volcanic glass because she'd chosen to stand with him. The rage that exploded through Ronan's chest was biblical. He roared and charged toward where Ashara had fallen, cutting through Imperial soldiers like they were made of paper. His sword became a blur. Every strike killed. Every movement was economy of violence refined through decades of practice. Men scattered in front of him, not because they were cowards, because survival instinct recognized a predator operating beyond rational thought. Celine stayed with him, always 3 steps behind, protecting his back, killing anyone who tried flanking him. They moved through the battlefield like a paired weapon. 2 people who'd learned to read each other's movements so well, they functioned as a single organism designed for destruction. But even rage has limits. Ronan took a spear through his shoulder. The impact spun him sideways. Another blade cut across his ribs. He felt bone crack. Blood poured down his side. His vision started tunneling, the edges going dark while the center stayed sharp. He was dying, had been dying since the moment he'd chosen to stand here. The body just hadn't caught up to the decision yet. A soldier raised his sword to finish Ronan off. Then his head exploded. Arrow through the eye socket. The body dropped. More arrows rained down on the Imperial soldiers surrounding Ronan. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Coming from the cliffs overlooking the shattered plain. Reinforcements. Ronan looked up through blood and sweat and saw banners he didn't recognize. Rebels from the eastern provinces. Deserters from southern garrisons. Common people who'd armed themselves with farming tools and decided that today was the day they stopped being afraid. They poured down from the cliffs like a flood. Maybe 2,000 of them. Not soldiers, not trained, just people who'd heard about the traitor king making his stand and decided that if he could fight, then maybe they could too. Maybe courage was contagious. Maybe watching someone refuse to kneel made other people remember they had spines. The battle shifted. Damien's army suddenly found itself fighting on 2 fronts. The pressure on Ronan's rebels eased. Men who'd been seconds from death got breathing room, space to regroup. The eastern flank stabilized, then pushed forward. For the first time since the battle started, Imperial soldiers began retreating. Not fleeing, not yet. Just pulling back, creating distance, trying to reform their lines while under assault from people who'd discovered that fear was a choice and they were choosing something different. Across the battlefield, Damien sat on his warhorse watching his perfect formation crumble. And beside him, Valor spoke quietly. "We need to withdraw, regroup, we're losing cohesion." "No." Damien's voice stayed cold. "We finish this. If we retreat now, we prove the traitor was right, that the Empire can be resisted. Every rebel across the continent will rise up. Then what do you suggest? I end this personally." Damien drew his sword. "I challenge Ronan, single combat. Winner takes the field." It was the old way. Before empires and armies and systematic warfare, alphas had settled disputes through personal combat, one-on-one. Let fate and skill decide who deserved to rule. Most kings had abandoned it as primitive, inefficient, too much risk concentrated in a single fight. But Damien understood optics. If he killed Ronan publicly, in front of both armies, it would break the rebellion's spirit, prove that the new king was stronger, worthy. Everything the Black Fang dynasty represented. And if he lost, well, at least he'd die trying to reclaim honor. Valor studied his king for a moment, then nodded once. Damien rode forward into the center of the battlefield, raised his sword high, and shouted loud enough for both armies to hear. "Ronan Kadros, face me! Brother to brother, king to traitor. Let's end this the way our ancestors would have, with steel and blood and no one to blame but ourselves." The fighting slowed. Both armies pulled back, created space. A circle of volcanic glass surrounded by thousands of people waiting to see which man would walk away. Ronan stood at the northern edge of the circle, bleeding from a dozen wounds, barely able to hold his sword. Every breath hurt. Every heartbeat felt like it might be his last. His body had passed beyond exhaustion into something that resembled functioning purely through willpower. "Don't do this," Celine said quietly beside him. "You're too injured. He'll kill you." "Probably," Ronan's voice came out rough. "But if I don't fight him, this never ends. He'll hunt us forever. At least this way it's decided. You don't have to prove anything." "Yes, I do." He looked at her. Her face was covered in blood and dirt. Her eyes burned with that same fierce intensity that had made him spare her life 12 years ago. To everyone who believed walking away was cowardice, to everyone who thinks power is the only thing that matters, I have to show them that choosing to be human doesn't make you weak. It makes you dead. Maybe. But at least I'll die as myself, not as what my father wanted me to become. Celine stared at him for a long moment. Then she grabbed his face with her good hand and kissed him hard. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "Then don't die," she whispered, "because I'm not done being angry at you yet." Despite everything, Ronan smiled. Then he walked toward the center of the circle. Damien was already waiting, younger, stronger, uninjured, everything Ronan should have been if he'd stayed king. The perfect weapon honed through resentment and isolation, and the burning need to prove he deserved what had been stolen from him. They faced each other across 10 feet of volcanic glass, brothers who'd never met until their lives collided in violence. "You could have been great," Damien said quietly. "Could have ruled for decades. Instead, you threw it away for a woman who wanted you dead." Ronan shook his head. "I threw it away because keeping it meant becoming someone I couldn't live with. The throne costs too much. It costs what it costs." Damien raised his sword. "And men strong enough to pay that price deserve to rule. Men too weak to pay it deserve to die. Then let's find out which one I am." They attacked simultaneously. And here's what people don't understand about fighting when you're already dying. It focuses you. Strips away everything except the immediate present. No future, no past, just the space between heartbeats where you're still breathing and the other person is still a threat. Ronan fought like that. Every strike was commitment. Every defense was instinct. His body moved on autopilot, drawing from 20 years of training, while his mind stayed detached. Observing, calculating, looking for the opening that would end this. Damien was good, better than good. He'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment, training in secret, building strength, channeling rage into technique. Every strike came fast and precise, no wasted movement, no hesitation. But Ronan had something Damien didn't: experience. Not just in combat, in sacrifice, in understanding what it meant to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. Pain was an old friend, exhaustion was familiar, and the edge between life and death was territory he'd walked before. Their blades met in a sequence of strikes too fast to follow. Sparks flew, metal screamed. Both men moved through forms that their father had taught them, drawing from the same source, fighting in the same style, but with different purposes. Damien fought to take. Ronan fought to protect. And that made all the difference. A strike got through Damien's defense. Ronan's blade opened a cut across his brother's shoulder. Not deep, not fatal, but first blood. The younger king staggered back, surprise flickering across his face. Then rage. He attacked with everything. Abandoned technique for pure aggression. Strike after strike after strike, trying to overwhelm Ronan through sheer violence. And it almost worked. Ronan blocked, but barely. Each impact sent shockwaves through his injured body. His grip faltered, his stance weakened. Damien saw the opening and took it. His sword swung toward Ronan's neck in an arc designed to take his head off. But Ronan dropped beneath the strike, let his legs give out, fell to his knees, and drove his sword up through Damien's chest. The blade punched through armor, through ribs, through the heart that had spent 30 years burning with resentment at being denied a throne. Damien gasped. Blood poured from his mouth. He looked down at the sword protruding from his chest, then up at Ronan, and in his eyes was something that looked almost like relief. Finally, he whispered, "Someone stronger." Then he died, fell forward onto Ronan. The weight knocked them both to the ground. Ronan pushed his brother's corpse aside and tried to stand, but his body refused. Too much damage, too much blood loss, everything shutting down at once. He collapsed face first onto volcanic glass. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Celine running toward him, screaming his name, her face twisted with something between rage and grief. Then nothing. Come. Consciousness returned slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep ocean, dark, cold, heavy. Every inch gained felt impossible, but Ronan kept pushing toward the light above, because somewhere in the back of his mind he remembered that stopping meant drowning. He broke the surface, gasping, Pain hit immediately. Overwhelming. Total. Every nerve ending screaming that his body was broken and shouldn't be functioning. But he was breathing, heart beating, alive somehow, despite all logic. He opened his eyes. A ceiling made of rough stone. Torches casting orange light across walls. The smell of herbs and blood and smoke. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain exploded through his torso. His shoulder. His ribs. Everything. "Don't move," a voice said. "Celine." She was sitting beside the bed, her broken wrist now properly splinted. Exhaustion carved into her face, but her eyes were alert. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Nearly died twice. Moving is a bad idea." "Where are we?" Ronan managed. His voice came out like gravel. "Rebel camp, 20 miles north of the shattered plain. We won. Barely. Damien's forces scattered after you killed him. Most surrendered. Some fled. Valor escaped with maybe 500 loyalists." Ronan processed that slowly. His mind felt thick, sluggish, like trying to think through fog. "How many did we lose?" he asked. "Too many." Celine's expression went hard. 143. Including Ashara. She paused. "But the reinforcements from the provinces. The people who came to fight. Most of them survived. They're calling you the wolf who walked away. The king who chose people over power. I'm not a king anymore. I know. But they don't care about titles. They care about what you represent. Proof that empires can be resisted. That fear isn't permanent." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been burning in his chest since he'd woken up. "Why did you save me?" Celine looked at him like he'd asked why water was wet. "Because you're my mate, you idiot. The bond won't let me just watch you die. And because somewhere between trying to kill you and fighting beside you, I stopped hating you." She paused. "Doesn't mean I forgive you for what you did to my family. Don't know if I ever will. But it means I'm choosing to build something new instead of staying trapped in the past." Ronan felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "What happens now? Now you heal. Then we figure out what comes next. The Empire is fractured. Damien's dead. Vialor's in hiding. The noble houses are fighting each other. It's chaos." "Good." Ronan closed his eyes. "Let it burn. Maybe something better grows from the ash." "You really believe that?" "I have to. Because if all of this was for nothing, if we just traded one tyrant for another, then everyone who died on that plane died for a lie." Over the next week, Ronan learned what had happened after he'd collapsed. The battle had broken Damien's army psychologically. Watching their king die in single combat had shattered the certainty that held them together. Most had surrendered immediately, thrown down weapons and begged for mercy. The rebels had given it, not because they were soft, because they understood that empires weren't defeated through slaughter. They were defeated by proving there was an alternative, by showing that people who'd been enemies could choose something different. News spread fast. The traitor king had killed his brother. The dynasty was broken. Varkros Keep stood empty. The throne room burned. And across the continent, people who'd lived under fear for generations started asking dangerous questions. What if we didn't have to kneel? What if power wasn't inevitable? What if we chose our own leaders? It wasn't revolution. Not yet. Just the beginning of possibility. Valor remained at large. His 500 loyalists had disappeared into the eastern provinces. Scouts reported he was building support, planning a counterattack, trying to restore the old order through force and nostalgia. But his support was shrinking, because you can't unring a bell. Once people see that resistance is possible, that kings can bleed, that empires can fall, fear loses its power. Not immediately. Not completely. But enough that cracks start forming in foundations built on centuries of violence. And cracks spread. 2 weeks after the battle, Ronan was strong enough to walk. His wounds had healed into scars that would mark him forever. The hole in his side where the sword had punched through. The cuts across his chest and shoulder. The dozens of smaller injuries that had accumulated into one massive testament to survival. He stood on the same cliff where he'd made the decision to fight, looking out at the shattered plain in the distance. The battlefield had been cleared of bodies, but the blood had soaked into volcanic glass and stained it darker. A permanent reminder of what resistance cost. Celine joined him at the cliff edge. Her wrist had healed enough to function. Still weak, but improving. She'd spent the past weeks helping organize the refugees. People displaced by war who'd lost homes and families, and everything except the breath in their lungs. There were thousands of them now, scattered across the northern territories, looking for direction, for purpose, for someone to tell them what came next. They want you to lead them, Celine said quietly. Build something new. A council maybe, representatives from every province. No more kings, no more dynasties, just people governing themselves. Ronan shook his head. I'm the last person who should lead anything. Spent 20 years proving I don't deserve that trust. You also spent the last month proving you're willing to die for people you'll never meet. That counts for something. Maybe. Ronan was quiet for a moment. But if we're building something new, it can't start with me sitting at the center. That's how empires begin. One person with too much power thinking they know what's best. So what do you suggest? We advise, guide, help them organize. But the decisions belong to them. We don't rule. We serve. And the moment that stops being enough, we walk away again. Celine studied his face. You really mean that? Yes. Because the throne corrupted everyone who sat on it. The only way to break that pattern is to destroy the throne entirely. No kings, no emperors, no single point where power concentrates until it turns poisonous. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay, we'll try it your way. But if this turns into another empire, I'm putting a blade through your chest myself. Fair enough. They stood together watching the sunset over volcanic wasteland. The sky turned red and orange and purple. Beautiful in the way that destruction sometimes is, when enough time has passed to forget the screaming. Ronan thought about his father, about Malvek sitting on the hollow throne beneath the palace, orchestrating wars to create the perfect Alpha, about Damien dying with relief in his eyes because someone had finally been stronger, about Valor out there somewhere still believing that the old ways could be restored. And he understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't evil. It was just corrosive, like acid eating through everything it touched. You could handle it carefully, use it for good purposes, build things, protect people, but hold it too long and it burned through your gloves and started dissolving flesh. The trick wasn't learning how to hold power without being corrupted. The trick was knowing when to put it down. I'm sorry, Ronan said quietly, for what I did to your family, for the Crimson Purge, for becoming the kind of person who could follow those orders without questioning them hard enough. Celine didn't respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice carried weight. I'm never going to tell you it's okay, because it's not. You took everything from me, turned my childhood into a nightmare, made me spend 12 years living for revenge. She paused. But I also understand now that you were a weapon your father pointed at targets. That doesn't excuse what you did, doesn't erase the bodies, but it means I can see you as more than just the monster who burned my world. She looked at him. And maybe that's enough. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement that people are complicated, that we contain multitudes, that the same hands that destroyed can also build. Ronan felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not peace. Peace was too clean, too simple. This was more like acceptance, the grim kind that comes from looking at yourself honestly and deciding that even though you'll never wash all the blood off, you can still choose what to do with the time remaining. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Celine's lips curved slightly. I'm still angry, probably always will be, but I'm choosing you anyway. The bond helped, but the choice is mine. Mine too, Ronan said, and standing on that cliff with scars covering both their bodies and an empire crumbling behind them, and the future uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility, they made a silent agreement to build something different, to try, to fail probably, but to keep trying anyway because the alternative was going back to the way things were. And that world had already proven it deserved to burn. Dark. 6 months later, the first council met in a city that used to be called Varkros. The obsidian fortress had been dismantled stone by stone, the throne room converted to a gathering hall, the dungeons filled with concrete, every symbol of the Black Fang dynasty torn down and repurposed into something that served people instead of ruling them. Representatives from 12 provinces arrived, farmers, merchants, former soldiers. Healers. People who'd survived the wars and carried the scars and decided that they deserved a voice in what came next. Ronan and Celine sat in the back, not at the head table, not leading, just present, available for advice when asked but silent otherwise, watching people who'd never governed learn how to argue without bloodshed, how to compromise, how to build something fragile and imperfect that might survive long enough to become strong. It was messy. People shouted, disagreed, walked out and came back. Progress happened in centimeters. Every decision took hours of debate. Nothing moved fast, but it moved forward, and that mattered more than efficiency. Because empires were efficient, kings made decisions instantly, orders were followed without question, things got done. But what got done was usually violent. This was different, slower, more frustrating, but built on consent instead of fear. And consent, Ronan had learned, was the only foundation worth building on. After the first council session ended, he and Celine walked through the rebuilt city. Where the volcanic fortress once stood, people had planted gardens, green things growing in black soil, life returning to places that had only known death. "Do you miss it?" Celine asked. "The power, the certainty, the throne." Ronan thought about the question honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted. Being king was simple. You made decisions, people followed them. You didn't have to convince anyone or compromise or wonder if you were doing the right thing. The crown gave you permission to be certain. And now I'm uncertain about everything. Whether this new system will work, whether people are ready to govern themselves, whether Valor will come back with an army and destroy everything we're building. He paused. But I'd rather be uncertain and human than certain and monstrous. At least this way, when I make mistakes, they're mine. Not because some dead king 300 years ago decided that fear was the only language empires speak. They reached the edge of the city where the gardens gave way to volcanic wasteland. In the distance, you could still see the shattered plain, the battlefield where everything had changed. Celine took his hand. Her broken wrist had healed mostly. Still ached when it rained. Probably always would. A permanent reminder of what resistance cost. "I used to think strength meant never breaking," she said quietly. "Never bending. Never admitting you were wrong. Just standing firm no matter what tried to move you. And now I think strength means breaking and healing and breaking again and still choosing to stand up. Not because you're unbreakable, but because you're willing to be broken and keep going anyway." Ronan looked at her. At this woman who'd tried to kill him, who'd hated him with the purity of something sacred, who'd chosen to build something with him instead of letting that hatred define her forever. And he understood something his father had never learned. Love wasn't weakness, fear was. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of admitting you needed someone. Fear of letting anything matter more than power. Because power was the only thing that couldn't betray you. But power betrayed everyone eventually. It just took longer, hurt worse. Left nothing behind except monuments built on corpses. Love was different. Messy. Complicated. Painful in ways that made you stronger instead of harder. And standing there with Celine's hand in his, and the sun setting over a world that was broken but healing, and the future uncertain but possible, Ronan finally understood what his father had spent his whole life trying to destroy. Hope. Not the naive kind that thinks everything works out. The grim kind that knows most things don't, but chooses to try anyway. The kind that survives because it refuses to believe that violence is the only language that matters. The kind that builds gardens in volcanic ash. Years later, when people told stories about the Iron Wolf, they argued about what the tale really meant. Some said it was about redemption, about a monster becoming human again through love and sacrifice. Others said it was about the cost of empire, about how power corrupts everyone who holds it long enough. Still others said it was about resistance, about proving that kings can bleed and thrones can fall and fear isn't permanent. But Ronan and Celine knew the truth. It wasn't about any of those things. Not really. It was about choice. The choice to question what you've been taught. The choice to walk away from power when keeping it costs your humanity. The choice to build something new even when you know it might fail. The choice to love someone who has every reason to hate you, and hope that choice means something in a world designed to punish mercy. They lived quietly after that, not in palaces, not in cities. Just a small house on the northern frontier where volcanic soil had finally started supporting crops. They built things, helped neighbors, advised the new council when asked, and spent their evenings watching sunsets over land that had once been empire and was now just earth. Celine never fully forgave him. Some wounds don't heal, some losses can't be replaced. The Crimson Purge remained between them like a scar tissue. Acknowledged, accessible, but never truly forgotten. And that was okay, because forgiveness isn't always possible. Sometimes you just learn to carry the weight together instead of alone. They had children eventually, 3 of them, kids who grew up in a world without kings, who learned that power came from consent, not domination, who understood that their father had been a monster once and chose to become something different. Not perfect, just different. And maybe that was the real lesson, that people aren't static. They're not forever defined by the worst thing they've ever done, or the best. They're collections of choices stretching across time, and every choice offers the opportunity to become something other than what you were. Ronan died first, old age, natural causes, surrounded by family in a bed that smelled like herbs and wood smoke. His last words to Celine were simple. "Thank you for choosing me." She held his hand until the end, then buried him facing the mountains where they'd fled after leaving Varkros Keep, where they'd learned to be something other than enemies, where they'd discovered that love wasn't destiny forcing you together, but 2 people deciding that together was better than alone. Celine lived another decade, long enough to see the council system spread across most of the continent, long enough to watch Vialor's final attempt at restoration fail as younger generations refused to kneel to the old ways, long enough to know that what they'd built wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes better is enough. When she died, they buried her beside Ronan. No monuments, no statues, just 2 simple graves on a hillside overlooking land they'd helped make peaceful. The inscription was the same on both stones. Here lies someone who chose to change. And in the years that followed, people would visit those graves and argue about what the story meant and whether the Iron Wolf was hero or villain or something in between. But the answer was simpler than they wanted to believe. He was human, flawed, broken, capable of monstrous things and miraculous things in equal measure, just like everyone else. The only difference was that he'd been given a throne and chose to walk away from it. Not because he was weak, but because he was finally strong enough to know that some things matter more than power. Like love, like mercy, like the future you leave for people who will never know your name. And in the end, after all the violence and betrayal and impossible choices, that's what survived. Not the empire, not the dynasty, not the legend of the king who couldn't be killed. Just the truth that every person carries the potential to become something better than what they were. And that transformation, that choice, that daily decision to keep trying despite everything is the most powerful thing in the world. Not domination, not fear, just the stubborn refusal to let the worst parts of your past define your future. That's the story of the Iron Wolf. And it ends not with a crown, but with a choice. The same choice everyone faces, to be ruled by what you were, or to become what you could be. The answer is always yours to make.